Hi, I'm Matt Albers, host of the Pirate History Podcast. The men and women of the golden age of piracy are some of the most infamous and often misunderstood characters in all of human history. You know their names: Anne Bonny, Henry Avery, Mary Read, Captain Kidd, Blackbeard. But do you know their stories, their real stories? Every week over on the Pirate History Podcast, we examine what made these pirates sail the high seas in search of plunder and adventure and revenge. If you'd like to hear the stories of the real men and women who went on the account and sailed under the black flag, join us on the Pirate History Podcast.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota. We have a three-way call going with myself, Danny Sjursen, and Danny Abdeljabbar. For those of you who don't know Danny Sjursen, he is a retired U.S. Army major, served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is also a historian and writer. You can find his work on publications such as The Nation and Antiwar.com and many more. They will all be in the description below. But Danny's great. He's incredibly smart. He brings really great context. We're talking Israel and Palestine and the deal of the century. And I think you guys are going to get a lot out of this episode. It turned out really well. So I hope you guys enjoy it. If you really enjoy it, though, make sure that you rate and review the podcast if you're on Apple. And we also have a Patreon as well. So you can find us at Patreon at Bro History if you want more content. But why don't we just get right into it? All right, so welcome to another show, Bro History. On today's show, we got a special guest. We have Danny Sjursen, who is now, I guess, retired major in the U.S. Army. Danny is a former history instructor at West Point, and he's also a combat veteran of both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can find his work on The Nation and Tom's Dispatch, among many other publications. Danny, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me back on again. I've really enjoyed it last time, and I've enjoyed the time we've spent together in person, and just looking forward to another great conversation.
Yeah, we were really looking forward to having you on. And Danny Abdeljabbar. I probably shouldn't say your name in the context of this conversation, Danny, for new listeners.
You almost forgot to mention that I was on the phone too.
Yeah, I forgot to mention. But Danny and I, we both had the privilege and the pleasure of seeing you actually debate this topic in person at the Soho Forum a couple months ago. And I forget the exact what the exact debate question was. It was in order for Israel to for there to be peace, Israel must defeat the Palestinian movement, something like that. Which you won,
hands down.
Hands down.
Like objectively, the crowd chose you.
Yeah. So, Danny and I, we were like, who should we get to speak about this issue, especially when it's a controversial issue? It's been called the third rail of politics many times. So we were like, Danny Sjursen is probably the best person to get on, and he'll come with a very nuanced view, and he'll be objective as possible. So thanks for agreeing to be here.
I'm glad to do it, especially on this topic. I think I've told you guys before in the past that I was warned when I first came into public life, in a minor capacity, like my first editor, and then a few after, actually warned me, whatever you write about, and I write about provocative stuff, but they were like, do not write about Israel-Palestine, period. It's not worth it. It will only cause you trouble. You're going to lose readers. You're going to alienate people. Don't do it. So, of course, me being me, a dissenting soldier who was essentially an atheist in the monastery for the last, 10 years of his career, I was like, well, now that you said that, I'm going to write even more about Israel-Palestine. And not just to be provocative, but quite frankly, because, you guys know this pretty well. Overseas, whether you're in Iraq or Afghanistan or any other, Islamic sort of state or Islamic influenced state, what you regularly hear is, look, part of the reason we hate America is because of your biased policy towards Israel. And so to me, it's like I would be doing a disservice to other veterans and to American policy abroad if I didn't jump all over this topic. So I'm glad to do it.
And we're glad to have you for it.
We wanted to talk about the quote unquote deal of the century. I'll just ask you flat out, like, what's your initial take on this?
You know, I could have quite frankly ignored the entire topic because, and I didn't. I mean, I read about it. I mean, I've followed Jared, nepotism, Kushner, and the whole deal. But I could have predicted that this was going to be stillborn right from the start, because the Trump administration, even worse than every American administration since Harry Truman has been wildly biased in favor of Israel. There's a few exceptions to that. George H.W. Bush parried in a more moderate direction at a time or two, et cetera. But for the most part, every executive has been wildly pro-Israel, right? I mean, Truman started it all off, right? And people don't know this history. You know, we're basically we recognize the Israeli state when it declares independence. You know, we recognize it within hours, right? And Truman literally says to like aides that, you know, well, there's lots of Jewish American voters, but there's like not a whole lot of Palestinian American voters. So like, I'm going to do the political thing, right? And we've essentially followed that ever since, right? But the Trump administration has been more wildly, and the thing is, honestly, like, the thing I appreciate about Trump is, like, yeah, he's a monster, but he's totally honest, at least about some things, right? So the thing about Trump is he doesn't even try to be balanced. And so the whole idea of like a deal of the century, first of all, how many deals has Trump actually like negotiated that have been effective? This whole like art of the deal persona has not been, you know, backed up by actual output over the last 2 years. So I distrusted it from the start. We'll get into why later, I'm sure. But the bottom line is, this has been the most one-sided pro-Israeli to the, not only to the, you know, detriment of Palestinians, but arguably to the destruction of any last hope for a two-state solution or any sort of independent sovereign Palestine. So, I mean, look, we're through the looking glass, Alice. I mean, this is serious. And of course, I never took seriously that America could be a fair arbiter. But with Trump at the helm, with Kushner, with no background in this except his own biases, with him as the point man, I mean, look, not only is it not going to work, not only is it one-sided, it's farcical. I mean, it's some Marx shit, right? History repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. We're in the farce zone right now.
Right.
It's interesting that you bring up that, you know, the U.S. has been wildly pro-Israel for the better half of the last century and this century as well. You know, I've been reading up on Israel Palestine, and I've been going back into, you know, post World War I, and it's interesting because, you know, I saw that there was a commission that went there. It was called the King Crane Commission, and the results were, this isn't going to work. Like, this is going to alienate the Palestinians. This is going to end up being a disaster. And then the commission ended up being suppressed by the British and the French. And it's kind of funny that sentiment definitely changed throughout the years. But I definitely agree. It's really hard to look at the Trump administration, especially with Jared Kushner negotiating this. And, you know, let's be honest, he has super close ties to Benjamin Netanyahu, as far as I think Netanyahu's even slept at his bed or slept at his house, and he stayed in his bed. Danny, you heard that, right?
Yeah, they were sleeping in the same bunk bed, right?
Wait, well, you mentioned Benjamin Netanyahu. Do you mean the assistant president of the United States? Because that's what I've been calling him recently.
The assistant president? You might be able to call Trump the assistant president.
That's a fair point.
Well, so I was hoping, Danny, that you know, for folks that might not be super privy to it, that we can get like a TLDR or like a quick version, even though this is like an impossible ask, of like, how did we get here with this issue, with the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Because as you mentioned, you know, it is kind of the third rail, and so a lot of people don't really know how it is that we got here. All they know is that, you know, there's, you know, two opposing factions, and, you know, as Americans, we're supposed to be on the Israeli side. So what context can you give us for like how we got to the point where now we're about to talk about this deal of the century?
I'm going to try to do something that's never been effectively done, and I'm going to fail at it, but you guys will get to be the recipients of it. And that is, I plan to give you a 90 to 120 second history that brings us up to date on Israel-Palestine, which is arguably the most complicated issue in the world, right? Or the most intractable issue in the world. A big surprise is that the United States, even though Truman was like pretty pro-Israel because of his political factioning and understanding there was a lot more Jews in the Democratic Party than there were Palestinians, actually until the 1967 or at least the 1973 war, okay, because there were several wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the United States was a little bit more of a fair arbiter. I mean, in the beginning, the United States was relatively lukewarm to Israeli militarism. And even though the United States certainly wouldn't have probably allowed Israel to be overrun by the Arab states, it was not the primary backer of Israel. In fact, early in the War of Independence, we're talking 48 to 49 now, it was Czechoslovakian weapons, right, out of the Warsaw Pact, or what was to become the Warsaw Pact, that really were the first influx of weapons that supported Israel. But over time, Israel-Palestine got wrapped up in the Cold War duality, right? The Manichaeism, the binary dichotomy of the Cold War vision, which of course was utterly flawed. And so since the Soviets were backing Egypt and Syria in particular, and Iraq to some extent, you know, Israel became an ally, and we called them the only democracy in the Middle East, which was like flawed from the start because Israel's apartheid-like system and occupation of the Palestinians and disenfranchisement of their own Palestinian citizens of Israel, that is, who make up about 20% of the country, made them not really a true democracy, and I would argue they're not even a true democracy today. But we said they were the only democracy in the Middle East, and we backed them largely to check the Soviets. And so that kind of helps explain why we went to a nuclear war footing in 1973 with the Soviets when the Egyptian and Syrian forces had initial success. Look, after that, it no longer was a purely Cold War problem, but it was a problem of lobbying and money. And this is where I'm going to get myself in trouble. And this is where Ilhan Omar, right, famously got herself in trouble recently when she said it's all about the Benjamins. Look, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that might not be correct, but it's a lobbying group in favor of Israel. It's extraordinarily powerful. It's got a lot of congressmen, a lot of senators in their pocket. There is no similar lobbying organization with any comparable power on K Street, right, in Washington, D.C. And Congress and executive after executive, president after president have been in the pocket of Israel to such an extent that the United States is, quote, honest broker, which is what we've, described ourselves as in several administrations, has really been a farce. And look, here's the bottom line. Since the 1990s, when the peace settlement at Oslo fell apart, and we could discuss why that is, but I'm not going to get into it now, the United States has stood aside while Israel broke basic international law, basic commitments that the rest of the world agreed with, basic commitments based on the Nuremberg principles that aggressive war is not a way to gain land. And they've become a settler colonial state. What I mean by that is, not only have they not given sovereignty to the Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank, but they've begun to settle land, especially in the West Bank, with Israeli Jewish-only settlements. So now you have a military occupation combined with a settler community, and the United States has done nothing. I think there's two major reasons for this, or three. One, it's the money from AIPAC, but that's not all of it. Two, it's the fact that, you know what? When the United States sees Israel being a settler colonial society, we're not as upset about that as other people, because you know why? Just like the Australians, we too were a settler colonial society. Israel's policy towards the Palestinians, they're pushing them into like reservations, is very similar to the way the American empire grew continental in the United States. We too were a settler colonial empire, and our victims weren't Palestinians. They were the various indigenous peoples who nearly went extinct by 1900. And the third reason, and this is the crazy part, and I'm like way over my 90-second goal, which is totally always going to be the case when we talk about this. The final crazy part is that evangelical Christians, who are a major, major force in American politics, are wildly pro-Israel, because upwards of 50% of them, to this day, in 2019, right, when we have science, they really, really, really believe that the end of the world is coming. And in order for the end of the world to come, according to their view of Revelations, the last book of the New Testament, Israel has to like form a state in the Holy Land. Now, of course, what they don't tell you is that once Jesus returns in their fantasy, all those Jews in Israel who don't convert are going to hell. But in the short term, they make common cause and they want us to give weapons and support to Israel because they read Revelations in such a way that they believe Israel has to come back to the Holy Land in order for the world to end. And these people are crazy, so they're really looking forward to the world ending. Now, the world will end in their grandparents, in their grandchildren's, lives, but it'll be climate change, not the reckoning that does it. Anyway, that's where we're at. And I'll be ready whenever you are to explain sort of what Trump has done to only inflame this further.
Well, I was hoping that you were going to say that Thanos was going to come by and snap us all away, but all of those options sound pretty reasonable in the context. So, all right, that was pretty awesome in terms of like a quick overview of like how did we get here, and I guess one thing that I did want to ask about, because I know that you had something interesting to say about this, is kind of how the rest of the world seems to be not allying with Palestinian, the PLO, but at least sympathizing with them in reasonable ways. And I know that one of those big allying forces was the PLO and the IRA in Ireland. I was wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about that and make some comparisons and contrasts.
Okay, yeah, three things, right? There's always got to be a magical three things. The first thing is that the UN General Assembly, which essentially has no power, it's symbolic, right? In the end, the United Nations is a dictatorship of 5 major imperial powers, right? Britain and France, who are like waning empires, Russia and China, which are larger, Eurasian empires, and then of course the United States, right? The General Assembly, they vote all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't become law because the United States, Russia, or China tends to veto it. The rest of the world, and I mean the vast filibuster-proof majority, right, to use an American term, of the world is essentially pro-Palestinian, or at least leans in the direction of Palestine deserving a state, right, and Israel ending its military occupation. UN Resolution 242 says that not only, and this is law, right? This is international law. Says that not only does Israel has to, give back the West Bank and Gaza, but it has to allow a 2-state solution, and it's not allowed to colonize territory because international law for a long time now, since the Second World War, since the Nuremberg principles were put in place, taking places over and then colonizing it with your own citizens is illegal in every single case. The only reason 242 is not actually followed through is because the United States vetoes any attempt by the rest of the world, especially by the General Assembly of small non-imperial nations, to force any change. Okay, so that's the first thing. The only reason Israel can do what it does is because of Uncle Sam. The top cover, the money, and the weapons, but more importantly, the diplomatic top cover, right? More importantly, the diplomatic top cover that the United States provides is the only reason Israel gets to act like a spoiled child on the playground, right? Israel does not have to follow the rules that everyone else does. Israel does. Look, here's one example. Why are we about to go to war with Iran? Well, because John Bolton is a monster. That's the short. that's the simple reason. But the broader reason is because we think they want a nuclear weapon, and God forbid Iran gets one. Now, I'm not a big fan of nuclear weapons at all. I mean, there's a sticker on my book that says like abolish nuclear weapons, right? Because I'm a hippie. But I certainly do want a little consistency. And Iran doesn't have a weapon yet. You know who has a few hundred secretly, but not so secretly? Israel. We say shit about that though. Right? So the inconsistencies are crazy. Do you know that Israel's actual policy, and this is fucking real policy, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to curse on this podcast, but
curse all you like.
Curse all you want.
Which is great because that's how I communicate New York style. But anyway, their policy is to neither confirm nor deny whether they have nuclear weapons. But everyone knows they have nuclear weapons, and the United States, I've seen the declassified documents that Kissinger threw around in the early 70s during the Nixon administration when Israel was first forming their arsenal. Like, we've known for 50 years that Israel had nuclear weapons. We never say a peep. So that's my point. Without an American top cover, Israel could never get away with this bullshit, like especially the settlements. Second, IRA was a subject of my first master's thesis. I wrote 2 because I'm a masochist. And I've always been interested in the IRA because I'm from partly from an Irish American family in Staten Island. My grandmother, who'd never once been to Ireland, taught me when I was about 8 that the IRA were freedom fighters and that the British were our historical enemies, right? So this was a fascinating concept for me my whole life. I no longer believe that to be true, at least not completely, but it broached the subject and it piqued my interest. So I've been studying it for many, many years in depth, and I've come to have a much more nuanced view of that war. But the bottom line is that the Irish Republican Army, which wanted a united Ireland and an end to British occupation of Northern Ireland, had an extraordinarily close relationship with 2 major international organizations. The first one was someone that no one has ever heard of, right, unless you're a dork like me, and that's the ETA, which is a Basque separatist group in Spain, right? They had a really close relationship. They shared weapons. The IRA sent them a bunch of pistols at one point. But they had a much more important, at least ideological connection to the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the quasi-secular conglomeration of mostly left-leaning Palestinian independence groups who were fronted by Yasser Arafat for many years. The IRA has murals in Belfast. You can Google this. I mean, please do, listeners. Where it'll be like an Irish tricolor flag and a Palestinian flag side by side with like a masked Irish gunman and a masked like Palestinian gunman, like side by side, saying like with like words like brotherhood or the struggle is real. You know, the struggle is linked. And so what you had was these disenfranchised nationalist groups worldwide who made common cause. I mean, you know, from the viewpoint of the IRA, their purported occupation by the British, well, it was an occupation by the British, right? Their view of Ireland being occupied by the British, to them was common cause with Palestinians being occupied by Israel. So while the Americans are providing top cover, these other nationalists, especially left-leaning organizations during the entire Cold War, are making common cause with the PLO, right? So that's the second point. And the third point is that even domestic groups, right, in the United States that saw themselves as disenfranchised, which, of course, given America's original sin of slavery and racism, we have to talk about African Americans, particularly in the urban ghettos of the Cold War, right? Especially the late Cold War, 80s, 90s. I'm a huge Wu-Tang fan. I'm from Staten Island. That's like
Ain't
the
nothing
proudest.
to fuck with, right?
Yeah, nothing to fuck with then and now. Wu-Tang is forever. I'm going to see him in Wichita July 31st because that's how I roll. I don't know what it's going to be like in Wichita, Kansas, but it'll probably still be raw. Look, Wu-Tang Clan, as well as other groups like Slain, who's a rapper from Boston, and others that and I think even Nas makes reference to Hamas regularly because they saw themselves as an occupied people themselves. And they are, right? They were and they are, because the increasingly militarized American police in the age of stop and frisk, in the age of broken windows policing, treated the neighborhoods that were black and poor or people of color and poor like occupied territory, right? We all know this. It continues to this day. So I counted once, and there's upwards of 20 Wu-Tang songs, including 4 or 5 that were radio hits, where they refer to the PLO. They say that they're the PLO of the ghetto, or they refer to their rhyming as PLO style. Google it. It's a thing.
I have heard that. I didn't make that connection.
Yeah, PLO style, they'll say, right? And like, to me, that's incredibly interesting because whereas the U.S. government, right, the corporate, white, Christian-dominated U.S. government has long just demolished any concept or any future of Palestinian freedom or Palestinian rights. The more indigenous and the more disenfranchised elements, even within the United States, have long made common cause with the Palestinians. What does this all mean, right? I think what it means is that globally America is out of step, or at least the American government is out of step. When you're the only country that believes something and 180 or 190 other countries are against you, it's possible that you're right, but statistically, mathematically, probably you're doing something wrong, right? When everyone else who has nothing else in common with each other is against you, including some elements of your own population. I think it's instructive. It's not just a piece of trivia, although it is an interesting, piece of just like trivia talk, but I think it's really instructive. And Yeah. So the bottom line is we're way out of step with the rest of the world. We always were, and we're getting even more out of step now that Trump is going further than any American president has ever dared.
I think an issue is that most Americans will never call Israel, or at least Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, they will never call that apartheid. I mean, what's your take on that? Like, is that an apartheid state like South Africa?
Israel is an apartheid state. By saying that, I'm going to decrease my book sales because mainstream Democrats and most of the Jewish political lobby, or at least the pro-Israel, because there's a lot of Jews who are actually against this. But the Israeli political lobby will of course be upset. Look, I've studied South Africa a lot. The similarities between the Bantu stands, which essentially were Indian reservations for black South Africans, right, and the occupied Palestinian territories, which are really a series of like fiefdoms separated by Israeli military roads and and by settlements of Jews. I mean, they look remarkably the same. They have two main things in common. One is a total lack of civil rights, meaning that black South Africans had no ability to vote at the polls, or at least have any power at the polls. And of course, Palestinians don't get to vote for the prime minister who leads the military occupation of their land, right? They have no right to vote. So that's the first similarity, of course. And the second one is gross poverty combined with just, militarist oppression within their own communities, right? So like we're talking about massive impoverishment. We're talking about income inequality at a level that even the United States, which is the worst in the world, can't even compare to, right? So those are the two things they have in common. So to not say that Israel's an apartheid state is ludicrous. Look, even Jimmy Carter, who gets a bad rap as like some sort of wild liberal, but like if you read my American history series or any serious historian with credentials, Jimmy Carter was a moderate Democrat. In one sense, he was actually a transition between the liberal Democrats and the more mainstream Democrats of Clinton. But as early as like 2004, and I might be off on that by a year or two, Carter wrote a best-selling book called Israel, Peace, Not Apartheid, and he got, of course, lambasted for it. But I'm saying, look, even major mainstream political figures on the American center left have admitted this, but very few are willing to do so who are currently in office. I mean, what Carter has going for him is his political career is over, right? He has nothing left to lose, so he can be honest, but like Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, whoever else is left from the, the I voted for Iraq mainstream militarist wing of the Democratic Party, they're all blatantly pro-Israel. And so is like Amy Klobuchar, right, and some other people who are in this race right now. The madness of 20 Democrats, running. So it is an apartheid state. I think it's words matter, right? I used to say this to my students when I would give them Fs at West Point, but like words matter. Like what you say matters. And I am of the opinion that it's actually, no matter how controversial it is, no matter how provocative it is, if the evidence points to Israel being an apartheid state, and it does objectively, we have to use that term. Because unless we do, the chances of the U.S. government, or as more importantly, the U.S. people, forcing their government to turn against at least the policy of Israel. And let me just throw a disclaimer. None of this means Israel shouldn't exist. That's why I'm a moderate on the world scene. In America, I'm a radical in this country. I'm a communist in my economic policies because I'm like moderately pro-labor, and I'm a radical because I think that Palestine should have a state. But the truth is that on the world scene, which is a more balanced, objective scene, I'm a moderate. I actually do think there's a special reason for the Israeli state to exist. I think it's problematic that it does. I think it was problematic from the start, but I do think that some sort of compromise is necessary because the historical disenfranchisement and destruction of the Jewish people, I think, is a special case, right? So that puts me squarely in the moderate camp worldwide, but far left or radical in America. But it's important to do this. And let's just do one other quick history lesson, and verbose history professor Danny's really coming out here, but I'll keep it short. Let us not forget, the United States was one of the last countries to turn on apartheid South Africa. White-dominated, terroristic, brutal regime of white South Africa until the late 1980s. The United States didn't turn against it. Why? Well, one reason is because Ronald Reagan was a bigot and he really liked the white guys running South Africa. But the main reason, which is why he tried to veto congressional attempts to sanction South Africa, but the main reason is because of the Cold War. Like, white South Africans, like, they may be brutal, but at least they were anti-communist. But those nasty black freedom fighters and the nationalist South African organizations, they used words like socialism, and they had taints like leftist, right? So in other words, the American government for year after year and decade after decade backed South Africa. So not only is it important to call Israel an apartheid state, it's important to remember that even if we did label it an apartheid state, America has a nasty history of allying itself with those very apartheid states. With that, I'm going to drop the mic for a moment and take a breath.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
If you enjoy bizarre true stories, then the Useless Information Podcast is the podcast for you. For example, did you know that author Robert Louis Stevenson gave his birthday away? Or that there was a football team that played for 6 years before someone realized that the school never ever existed? Or that a dog in upstate New York was once placed on trial for murder? Well, to hear these and hundreds of additional fascinating true stories from the Flipside history, be sure to check out the Useless Information Podcast. That's the Useless Information Podcast, podcasting worldwide since 2008 and available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Be sure to check it out.
Yeah, that's a lot of interesting context. I think that link between South Africa and Israel is pretty clear. And I think one of the points that you brought up that seems the clearest to me is the way that the occupations are being handled. And I do want to talk about the deal of the century, but before we do that, I think it's kind of impossible to talk about this deal without talking about the makeup of the current occupation right now. Because none of the actual details of the deal have been released yet, but through some leaks we kind of start hearing a little bit about a semi-autonomous mini-state called New Palestine maybe popping up in this deal that would be comprised of like areas A and B of the West Bank, and maybe the capital would be somewhere in like the expanded boundaries of like Jerusalem. But on the face of it, that sounds like, hey, that's not so bad. They get there's your two-state solution. But without like looking at a map or without knowing the context behind this, I think it's really like not as good as it sounds. So I was hoping, Danny, could you try and like with words explain how Palestine is being occupied and the differences between the A, the B, and the C areas, and kind of like that Swiss cheese effect that's going on. Just shed some light on exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, the Swiss cheese term is one that I was going to use. First of all, you asked that I give a rundown of the most complicated situation in the world today in words. And that's great, because if I was on video, I would probably attempt like an interpretive dance, just because I feel like that would be like a more artistic and less scientific way to get my point across. No, the bottom line is, okay, you got areas A, B, and C, and I'm not going to into a lot of detail about them, but these are Israeli terms for Palestinian land, right? These are Israeli decisions and strictures that affect Palestinian life. Certain areas of Palestine are actual Israeli settlements, and they're no-go zones, and the roads between them are no-go zones. They're either military roads or they're settler-only roads, right? So they're apartheid roads, and that constitutes one of those letters. Then there's also the areas that have a slight degree of Palestinian autonomy, and then there's the areas that have much more degree of Palestinian autonomy. But the A, Bs, and Cs are so mixed up that not only is Palestine no longer contiguous between Gaza, which is on the southwest of Israel and on the Mediterranean coast, and the West Bank, much larger, which is along the Jordan River and then all the way out to East Jerusalem. Not only are those two parts of the Palestinian state or nascent Palestinian state or future Palestinian state not connected, but within the West Bank, because of the settlements, because of the military roads, because of the different, A, B, C designations, which, by the way, are completely arbitrary. I mean, these are Israeli imposed, and I've said that already, but they're Israeli imposed strictures. I mean, this is some Kafka-esque shit, right? And to a Palestinian, so I could tell you all day what this means in terms of international law, what it looks like on a map. Here's what it means for a Palestinian. I think I'll end with this. For a Palestinian, it means that Israel has potentially de facto annexed some of their ancestral land, even some of their farmland for an individual. They have built a separation barrier, an illegal wall that actually
build a wall.
Walls are really popular again. I love this right-wing populist surge, like from Brexit to Trump to Hungary. Like, the world sucks. Like Brazil. Like, I mean, anyway, that's a whole set. We should do that next time. But so now we have walls running through Palestinian territory, like what international law calls Palestinian territory. So like some people are actually separated from their olive trees and their fields, right? And then you also have the reality of Israeli drones and planes in the sky violating what should be Palestinian sovereign airspace. The reality of soldiers at checkpoints. If I want to travel from Jenin to Jericho to Ramallah, right? We're talking like north to south, right? I don't know if that order is correct, but it could take me, and this is not a big country, right? This is not a big country. It could potentially take me, 7 hours to travel like 30 miles because I got to go through Israeli checkpoints. Then I got to stop. Then I'm only allowed on these roads. Then I get stopped at another checkpoint. Then there's a wall, so I got to make a long detour. Look, the reality is what you said is correct. Israel has turned what was already a fractured Palestinian state, right, and an illegally and immorally fractured Palestinian entity. They've turned it into Swiss cheese. And so, look, Google a map of Palestine today, and if you find the right ones, it'll show you that rather than a contiguous state from the Jordan River to East Jerusalem, which should be their capital, what it really looks like is, almost like an ink blot, like psychiatrist test, but worse than that. It's like it's pixels, right? It's these little cantons that are sometimes like 1 mile by 1 mile or even less, separated by military roads, Israeli soldiers and Israeli settlers. And Palestinians aren't even allowed to go near Jewish settlements because the reality is there are two types of citizens. Palestinians are second-class citizens. Palestinians are 12th-class citizens, and Israelis are A-grade citizens. I mean, the distinction between Israeli life in the settlements, which are illegal, and Palestinian life in their villages, which are their right, the difference between them is a chasm greater than we could possibly bridge.
Yeah, I definitely think that's really good context because, when I was first reading about this many years ago, looking at, the difference between Israel, Palestine on the map, I was like, oh, well, that's a little weird that Gaza's off to the left, and West Bank is on the other side. How could they possibly have a state? They can't move in between the two. And that's legitimately like a big portion of the issue of creating a two-state solution, just the fact that they're so completely separate from one another. But the more you read about it and the more you look into it, it's worse than just the distance and the split between Gaza and West Bank. It's like West Bank itself is being like Swiss cheesed. I don't know how better to say that.
Let me add to that real quick.
Mm-hmm.
I should have said this. This is all purposeful Israeli policy. Netanyahu, who has gone so far as to say he's thinking of actually just outright annexing illegally, like officially annexing parts of the West Bank. But like Netanyahu and the Likud party and even the center left and the center right of Israeli politics, they're purposely trying to fracture and Swiss cheese away Palestine, because what they're trying to do is create facts on the ground where a Palestinian state in the future is no longer viable. And they have had remarkable success in doing that because, dude, we're 3 smart guys, and we can get 10 smarter guys and go on a commission together, and we would have a lot of trouble putting Humpty Dumpty back together again because the Israelis have created facts on the ground that make a Palestinian sovereign entity almost impossible. And that's if we decided tomorrow to do the right thing, and we haven't even gotten close to that.
Right. Yeah. And it certainly does look very intentional, even without reading any documents or like seeing any proof, just looking at the way that it's constructed just seems like, why would you do that? Why would you put a settlement smack dab in the middle of the West Bank and then carve out this whole corridor in the middle of it just so that you can get there? I always assumed, when I was more naive, when I was not hip to this particular issue, that the settlements were on the border, right? That the settlements were they were encroaching on the border and pushing farther and farther into the border. And it was just that simple. And, the idea in my mind was, stop pushing forward. But in fact, it's much, much crazier. And what that does, at least for the Palestinian people, is that obviously they lose, acres and acres of their own land, right? Miles and miles of their land. And you pointed out a couple of situations where like you could be an olive farmer, right? And then half of your olive grove is just gone now because you can't access it because they put a road in between it and you can't access that road, right? So they're either illegally settling on that land, which we've already pointed out that this is under international humanitarian law, you can't do this, or they're illegally exploiting those natural resources, right, by straight up taking them, right? Hey, here's a real fertile area of the West Bank. We're gonna put a real nice, settlement on here, and we're gonna set up shop, and we're gonna do
one quick thing: water.
Mm-hmm.
Water is a major resource in the Middle East, and the Israelis have been very careful over the course of 50 years to monopolize the best water resources and starve the Palestinians or dehydrate the Palestinians.
Correct. And so those severe restrictions on how Palestinians can use their own resources, itself is very, very problematic. So when you try and think about like even the creation of this new Palestine, if such a thing could be possible, right? But they got the best people on it, I'm sure. It doesn't seem to address the biggest issue, and the biggest issue is that literally the people of New Palestine wouldn't be able to move around anyway.
They're the most stateless, disenfranchised people. One of the most stateless and disenfranchised people on the planet, and people like my father, who is like the poster boy for like white male resentment. Right, like middle-aged white male resentment, but he's a really important guy. I mean, he's a really important person because he's like smarter than your average bear, which is so hard for me to admit for a man who voted for Trump. But he is. But he represents that like 40% of Americans who are like in the conservative camp, and like one of his things, and everyone like him things is like, yeah, but the Palestinians are suicide bombers. But like, and I'm going to say something here that's going to really make people think I'm a radical. I think suicide bombing, especially of civilians, is like one of the most abhorrent tactics ever. But you understand why people strap bombs to themselves when they're placed in such a Kafkaesque, impossible scenario of repression. You understand it. I mean, it doesn't mean it's right. It just means there is a reason these people strap bombs to their chest. And by the way, a tiny, tiny, tiny percent of them do that. Most of them are just as upset about it as the Israelis. But right. Look, this is why it happens. We've created a situation where they are stateless forever, and impoverished forever. What recourse do they have? They don't get arms shipments from America with F-16s like the Israelis do, or what are we at? F-80?
35.
Like, yeah, 35. I mean, whatever. Like, as the world is like going underwater from climate change, I'm sure we'll be at like F-55.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I get that. It's again, to underscore the fact that like suicide bombing is never a good thing ever, period. Like full stop.
The issue
the context is there.
I'm sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but the issue is that they conflate everything with radical Islam. Everything is just radical Islam. Like they can't be trusted because they're all fanatic religious zealots who will blow you up. And that's why the colonization is necessary, because it's for national security, because these people are insane.
Yeah,
that's the argument that I
share. Look, the language they use, like Israeli officials, I'm talking like primaries in the Israeli cabinet have used terms like termites, right? Insects, infestation for Palestinians. They've gone so far
like in
say,
Rwanda.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is how you get a genocide. Like this, and I mean, what's going on is a slow-moving genocide, quite frankly, or maybe not. I don't want to say genocide. It's a slow-moving ethnic cleansing, right? I think that's more appropriate, more moderate.
Sure.
and factual. But look, another thing that's going on here is, like, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that these protests, these very, 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 very peaceful protests at the Gaza border wall or the Gaza border fence that have been going on for 2 years now, in which 400 plus Palestinians have been killed, about a quarter of whom were children, about a tenth of whom were journalists and or medical aid workers for the Red Crescent. Look, only like 3 or 4 Israelis have been killed. And those of us who are in the military know about the concept of proportionality, don't we? And when the casualty rates are that disproportionate, it actually becomes problematic, up to and including the fact that it might be considered a war crime. But
Right.
major Israeli ministers, I think it was the deputy foreign minister, who's a female, was on like CNN, like not even on Fox, right? They weren't even on like fascist radio. They were on like CNN or MSNBC, which is like neoliberal fascist media. But anyway, and this woman said, like, well, they asked her, like, one of the American announcers like had the balls finally, and to say, like, wait, you just said they're all terrorists, like they're all Hamas, like all these people that are peacefully protesting that keep getting killed by Israeli soldiers. And the lady, like the foreign minister lady, the deputy foreign minister, was like, yeah. And so an American showed a little bit of courage and said, even the children? And she says, yes, the children are all Hamas.
Especially the
I mean,
children.
that's the language of like infestation and termites
Yeah.
that leads to ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
Netanyahu, he was blaming the Palestinians on the Holocaust not so long ago. He was like, Hitler didn't want to blame the Jews. He didn't want to burn the Jews at first. It was the Palestinians that told him to do it. These are words that came out of Netanyahu's mouth.
Oh yeah, I mean, Netanyahu is so far right that he does what all far right figures do in their societies, which is what they do is with populism and revanchism and racism, they actually they grab the entire political spectrum, right, and they forcibly just move the whole thing right. In other words, when you have a Trump or when you have a Netanyahu, people like us start to seem like fringe liberals, because in comparison to Trump, we are. So Trump and Netanyahu and Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? These folks, and now fucking Boris asshole
Yeltsin.
Johnson
Yeah,
in
whatever his
goddamn
name
London,
is. Yeah.
like these, like, yeah. I mean, first of all, doesn't his haircut preclude him from being a national figure?
I know, right? You
guess
think they
not.
would have
I guess
learned.
not. We've seen Trump's hair, so apparently, you ever notice that? Why is it that right-wing populist monsters, like, leaving aside their policies of like mass murder and repression, they do have one other thing in common: really bad haircuts and facial hair. Someone needs to write a book about it. There's something there, I promise you. Anyway, I'm being facetious. But the bottom line with all of this is Bibi Netanyahu talks in ways that even within Israel would have been unacceptable as recently as 20 or 30 years ago. But the political spectrum has been uprooted and moved so far right by the Likudniks and particularly the ultra Orthodox in Israel, that now Bibi Netanyahu is considered like a center-right candidate or a center-right political figure in his country, when in reality he's off the charts. And we're seeing the same thing happen in America, of course.
I mean, what do you make of it? Like, what do you do about it? You know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a lot of radical thoughts
Opinions.
about that. But I mean, I don't trust either major political party in America, and I don't trust either major political party or the 3 or 4 major political parties in Israel. They've shown themselves to be closer together on most foreign policy issues than they are divided. They've shown themselves to be utterly corporate, utterly militaristic. And so I'm of the belief that, like the civil rights movement, grassroots action of civil disobedience up to and including shutting the system down may be our only hope. Because let's look, I'm sure we all have some favorite Democrats right now. We've probably all got a few favorites in the primary that we think are going to save the world. And I have my favorites too. But I do not believe that even the best of them can transcend the Democratic National Committee, the money in American politics, the money in Israeli politics, to really take the radical change that we need. And arguably it may take shutting down monetary system, the transportation system, et cetera. And so there I go being a hippie, but I think that's true.
Hopefully we don't have to get there, and hopefully we can, through civil discourse, get to the points that we need to make. And on that topic of money, I'd like to turn back a little bit to this deal, because a big portion of this, deal of this century is money, right? So as I understand it, the aid package that they're proposing is somewhere between $30 and $40 billion over 5 years. And by the way, a bulk of it is going to be provided by Gulf states, so like other Arab states, with small contributions from the United States, EU, and others. So I find this pretty interesting because I read something on the World Bank that I'd like to throw at you and see just what your opinion is on here. But apparently the World Bank estimated in 2013 that actions and restrictions that the Israeli government have taken in that area C of the West Bank, and that's the area that's like under exclusive Israeli security control, that they estimate that cost the Palestinian economy $3.4 billion per year. So back of the envelope math here, if you were to lift those restrictions, then over 10 years, you'd get the same economic benefit that this plan would give the Palestinians without actually investing a single cent in it. And it would be indefinite, right?
Okay, so Israel gets $3 billion of direct military aid with no strings attached every year, right? So that means over the course of 10 years they get 30, right, at least, and that doesn't include some of their private sales of American weapons, right? It doesn't include the military aid they get from American allies.
Right.
The thought that there is like a pure economic solution to this problem, the thought that like Trumpian capitalism, which is really crony capitalism, can somehow create enough affluence to moderate the Palestinian people. I mean, the way I read it is this: like, this is Trump and his ilk of hyper capitalists, right? Saying, well, we can bribe the Palestinians to accept their shitty situation.
This is their Stormy Daniels hush money.
It really, but it is, right? It's funny, and it's fucking funny, and it's tragic, but it's true. The guy thinks that way. I mean, Trump is a street con. He's a 3-card Monte player, okay? He doesn't even understand economics outside of, like, payoffs to the mafia for casinos. I mean, this is how he thinks. And it's refreshing in a way that he's so honest about it. Because the old Republicans would, like, lie and be like, no, it's trickle down, it's supply side, there's a science to it. Trump's like, fuck it, I just pay bitches not to tell them I raped them. You know what I mean? Like, so, like, it's like, that's, I'm sorry, but like, that's how he thinks. And the point is, he's a con man. The reality is this is a political solution that has to involve a military withdrawal. It has to involve a reinfusion of civil rights for the Palestinians, and has to involve a massive change in the Israeli occupation, up to and including the removal of almost all the settlements, except maybe some of them that are right on the border that can be transferred for requisite Israeli land. There is no way to buy Palestinian ascension to this. They will never assent to it. My prediction is a third intifada, actually, a third massive uprising of the Palestinian people once the final plan is put out by Trump.
That sounds scary. Again, I'm a pretty big pacifist and hope that it doesn't have to come to that. That sucks. I'm hoping you're wrong. Let's just put it that way.
It's funny though. It's funny that you bring up Trump about being he's so transparent. Like with Saudi Arabia, when he was getting flack for the $110 billion in arms sales, and he was just like, well, what am I supposed to do? These Muslims hate these Muslims. We need to sell them weapons.
Oh, it's mad. That's how he thinks, though. I mean, he thinks like a con man. I just want to caveat and say that my use of the term bitches for the women that Trump has allegedly raped was inappropriate. But the bottom line is, I got carried away, and I think he does think that way.
I appreciate the caveat, and I'm sure
we say way more inappropriate stuff on this show. Don't worry. You should have heard what we said about. I got in trouble from my family when we were talking about George Bush and Margaret Thatcher. We speculated on some type of an affair, but not really.
Oh man.
Let's be honest. In that relationship, Margaret Thatcher was the alpha.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure. Anyway, I think you bring up a good point, Danny. I don't think that they can that any deal can just buy away Palestinian statehood or buy away the plight of the Palestinians in general. Another really big kind of lynch point for this is like the Palestinian right of return. And so for those folks who are unaware, many Palestinians fled Israel-Palestine during all of the intifadas. Millions and millions of them. I think there was 750,000 were displaced during 1948's war. And between then, the other intifadas, and just population growth, there are more than 7 million Palestinian refugees scattered around the world. And funny enough, when we were at your debate, I believe that your opponent had cleared up to me that evidently I might be a Palestinian refugee based on like how they say that is, because my father was Palestinian, is Palestinian, I should say, and their family fled. So the
Hamas.
Shut up. I guess the question that comes up a lot is like, all right, cool. Let's pretend for whatever reason that we can make a new Palestine, right? And somehow they figure out the Swiss cheese thing and that works out. So maybe they link it with some corridors, whatever. And let's say that $40 billion over 5 years, maybe that's really awesome and good for the the burgeoning new Palestinian economy, right? And it's super helpful for them, and they're coming up. So what about all the people who have been waiting generations at this point to come back to their homeland? Will they have that opportunity?
This is probably the most intractable problem of the whole issue, and this is where I sound like a moderate. This is where like Palestinian activists would take some exception with me, or at least the more radical ones. I think that it is utterly unrealistic and logistically impossible for 7 million Palestinians or even 2 million Palestinians to be repatriated within the boundaries of Israel and get their land back. It's just been too long. There's been too much population growth, and there's too many of them. But in theory, they have international law behind them, and they have morality and ethics behind them. What does that mean? Well, I like to describe the right of return as symbolic and similar to American debate, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates has been talking about this a lot with American reparations for African Americans. Mm-hmm. To me, the right of return is an apology from Israel that is backed by something that is maybe symbolic, maybe tens of thousands being allowed to return to the Israeli borders, although not to their original houses, because 3 generations worth of Israeli Jews have lived there now. We can't displace them either. But I think there has to be some form of reparations I think Israel has to say, look, guys, like we can't logistically or ethically allow 7 million of you into our borders and like to swamp the population of a relatively not populous state, because it would cease to be a Jewish state, right? But they have to say that our historic wrongs against you are such that not only will it be a symbolic return and an apology, but some form of economic reparations. Some Palestinians would take a lot of issue with what I just said, because they would say that I'm waving away an historic crime, and I am, right? But I'm also a realist, and I think Israel's going to have to pull that checkbook out and make some concessions in the West Bank and Gaza to make this right, and they're going to have to give a lot. But I don't think it's realistic for Israel to give exactly what the Gazan protesters are calling for. But I don't even think that most Palestinians really think it's possible. I mean, they're making a big ask, hoping that the compromise is a middle zone. I think that's what's happening.
Also, like for a technical Palestinian refugee like me, I don't want to go back. Like, I'm fine here in America. I love America, right? And I'm sure there are plenty of Palestinians living abroad that love where they live. So, for example, the folks, the majority of the refugees of Palestine live in Jordan, right? Almost 2 million of them, so 40% of them. And in Jordan, many of them, 95% of them have been given citizenship, right? They're able to participate in political and economic life. Most of them also don't live in like the tents, like the camps that are run in Jordan or in many other places. So they like live normal lives as newly Jordanian citizens. So Palestinian, like culturally and of their heritage, but on their passport it says that they are Jordanian citizens, and they're quite content with that. But that's not a problem, right? The 2 million people that are living in Jordan probably won't take too much issue with not being able to come back. It's the folks
I think you're right. Yep.
Elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And specifically in places like Syria, which is unfortunately its own fucking quagmire, right? And Lebanon specifically, right? So folks living in Lebanon, they're in legit camps, right? Severely restricted by the Lebanese government
for 70 years now,
right? And I mean, they're not granted citizenship. They're considered foreigners. They have no political rights. They're denied social rights, like including access to government-run public services like education or healthcare, social security, shit like that. But and the folks that were in Syria before, actually, Syria was pretty good with integrating them into their society. Like many of them had access to government services, employment, things like that. But they weren't given citizenship. But at least they were better off than the folks in Lebanon. But now, now there's not even like really a Syria for them to be in. So and that's we're talking about millions of people now, right? Millions of people that are living in places that do not accept them for who they are, and they can't go back to wherever they believe home is. They have no home. They're effectively stateless people. So where do they go?
Serial killers, strange disappearances, unexplained mysteries, terrible disasters. I'm Nate Hale, and in my show, The Conspirators, I'm here to tell you all the stories from history your teacher never told you about. Hear the real story behind the Bermuda Triangle, or about the history of people drinking blood to stay young, or about the serial killer operating in Nazi-occupied Paris, or what dark secret lurked within the walls of a Scottish castle. In my show, The Conspirators, I take you on a journey through some of the darkest corners of history, where you'll hear about the folklore, myths, and misconceptions behind some of the darkest events that ever happened. Listen to The Conspirators on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction.
What do we do with them?
Yeah, I actually patrolled an area of East Baghdad in 2007, from like February to April 2007, called Bella Diat, and it's a Palestinian refugee community. I mean, they don't live in tents, but they live in slums in East Baghdad, and they were also relatively stateless. I mean, Saddam had oppressed them, even though they were Sunni and he was Sunni. Like, they were just sort of like in between. They didn't fit,
For sure.
And Al Qaeda didn't like them, and the Shia didn't like them because they were Sunni, and Saddam didn't like them because they weren't Iraqi. I mean, I saw this firsthand, and it was really devastating. And most of them were refugees of 48, so they've been at that point in Iraq for 60 years, right?
Right.
Still living in the ghetto. Again, here's why I think economic restitution is so important, and I'm gonna compare it again to this whole reparations debate in America. In the United States, the average African-American family has less than 1/8 of the accumulated wealth of the average white family. Now, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Part of it, though, is a function of federal government housing policy that made it nearly impossible for African Americans to purchase their own home. So what's the number one way to accumulate wealth, right?
With assets.
Generational wealth, assets, it's specifically housing, right?
That's right.
And African Americans own houses and have owned houses at rates that are a fraction of white Americans. And so household wealth, generational wealth, is almost non-existent in the black community in America, even in 2019. So the idea behind reparations is that in order to right some of those wrongs, we're never going to be able to make up for that 1/8 or 1/10 that you are, but we're going to give you some sort of boost that puts you back on a scale or on a platform where you can compete, right, with white America. I think the same can be said of Palestinians, because here's what happened. The land and the houses that they left behind when they ran away during the initial War of Independence, or in the 1967 War of Israeli aggression, they never got the accumulated capital associated with the worth of their land or the worth of their homes. I mean, they were never paid back. And so what you can argue is, even if they don't live in refugee camps, even if they live decently well in Jordan, right, or in the West, they still were robbed, right? They were robbed of their accumulated family wealth, which in some cases was generations long, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they started life on an uneven platform, right? It's like I talk about reparations, and I talk about Black civil rights, which is actually what my PhD subject is, because I'm a masochist and I changed from IRA stuff. The reality is, like, I describe it as like a game of Monopoly. Like, everyone says, like, well, everyone's equal now. We got a black president, right? Everyone's equal now, in Israel, which is clearly untrue. But it's like, what if, like, the best way to describe it with black and white Americans is, like, white Americans, they got to roll the dice like 12 times. Like, they got to, like, move around the board and, like, buy shit up. You know what I mean? Buy up the railroads, like, flip around, free visits to prison for like 12 turns. And then we let African Americans do it. But, like, by then, most of the good property was bought up, right? And they started so far behind that we have to level the playing field. I would argue it's the exact same situation between Israeli Jews and Palestinian refugees, even if the Palestinian refugees have been settled in a relatively stable country for decades now.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, I don't disagree with you. I think that analogy to monopoly makes a whole lot of sense. But where I disagree with you on the right of return is just, it's more important to me that the folks that are living in countries that aren't allowing them citizenship or aren't allowing them basic human services, that they have a place to return. And I understand the logistical nightmare that it would be to bring 7 million Palestinians to Israel. Israel is a very small place. Even if they were to cram them just into the areas of whatever this new Palestine is that they have there, I think completely writing it off and saying there is no right of return, you will not return. It's morally inept, I think, but it also kind of goes against the, like, UN General Assembly, like, resolutions that have been reaffirmed, like, since 1949. So
no, so I actually don't think I want to clarify. We don't disagree that much. I think one of the real challenges of this is that we're going to have to treat Palestinians unequally, or at least not unequally. We're going to have to treat Palestinians on a case-by-case basis, given their context. And I agree with you that the situation of a relatively affluent Palestinian living in Germany versus a Palestinian who's literally lived in a tent for 4 generations is going to have to be taken into account. And so not only financially, but also in terms of who gets to actually go back to Israel, we're going to have to take that into account. I don't think every Palestinian is going to be treated equally. I think it's going to be a much more complex process. And those people who are in tents in Lebanon, and those people who are, like, being starved in the open air prison of Gaza are probably going to have to get a degree of special treatment. And that may mean that if we do have 100,000 symbolically returned, we're going to pull those from, and I made that number up, but we're going to pull those from the most desperate Palestinians, because I do agree that it's not just money. It has to be more.
Right. And at that point, if we're looking at special treatments for folks that are in particularly dire situations, we're looking at people in the counts of millions, not hundreds of thousands anymore. Just between Gaza and Lebanon alone, that's like 1.5 million people,
And that's where it gets complicated. And so I don't pretend to have the answer, but I'll tell you what I do think. I think we should be studying this in a serious way. I think there should be binational and international working groups that are on this, and people that have a lot more information than you and I need to be dealing with this incredibly intractable problem. So instead of denying the right of Palestinians to have anything, people who are super smart have to be studying, like, well, how do we make this work? Because there is a moral component. And you're right, it's in the millions. And so when I talk about a symbolic right of return, I understand that that's not sufficient. But I'm also aware of the logistics. And so I'm very torn on this issue. I think one of the reasons you guys invited me on is because even though I seem like a radical in America, a lot of my positions or a lot of my instincts are, they're pretty moderate on the world scene, and not pro-Israeli, but definitely sympathetic to Israel. And, it makes me uncomfortable to say that. And I'm so used to being painted with the radical pro-Palestinian brush here. But I think what you're raising, the difference between us that you're raising, it neither insults me nor worries me. It actually is extremely important, right? Like the little bit of difference between you and I is like the kind of business that some future international and binational Israeli-Palestinian tribunal is going to have to work with. And so I think it's incredibly important that you brought that up.
I'm glad. So we're running a little late here, and Henry, I know you've been quiet for the whole time. I want to give you an opportunity to maybe say something if you have anything.
No, I'm just picking your brains. I guess my big questions really are: is there a country that could actually mediate this? I feel like Jared Kushner, he kind of like fancies himself as like the new Henry Kissinger. If you see his interviews on TV, I saw an interview on Al Jazeera, and he it was quite telling. It was funny. Is there someone who can actually mediate this? Is there a country that could be neutral and mediate a deal?
Spain and Norway did a decent job in 92 and 93. But it bothers me to choose a Western country. So, but I also don't trust Saudi Arabia, because they're American lackeys. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think it has to be a country or series of countries that have no skin in the game. Because if they don't, then it gives them a level of objectivity that neither the United States nor Russia nor Saudi Arabia nor most of the countries in the West have. But I will say that the Scandinavian countries who are fat and happy and like live in the dream in their social democratic socialist states that are like super woke, like they're not the worst candidates. But I would like to see an Arab/Muslim component to it, just for the sake of not being the white savior, to these problems, which I'm always, as a guy who is working on a PhD almost done in African American civil rights, like a white boy, like I'm very, very like cognizant and like worried about that. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think you bring up a good point, because the international arbiters are gonna have to be very carefully selected.
Well, if we storm Area 51 and find the aliens, maybe we can ask them to do it for us.
No, they're not going to touch this issue. It's too dangerous.
Right? They're gonna go back to their galaxy and be like, "Fuck it, it's hard."
What do you think about that, by the way, Danny? Not to change the subject too hard, but
I don't know. I have like a weird relationship with conspiracy theories. Like, part of me is like an Occam's razor guy who's like, the simplest answer is always true and the conspiracy is always wrong. But then there's the part of me that like obsessively watches like shows about JFK's murder and like does think that like 9/11 is like maybe not a conspiracy, but definitely like not a full story yet. So I'm a skeptic of conspiracy theories, but I am equally skeptical of any governmental line coming out of Washington. So it would not surprise me if there's some shit that the conspiracy theorists, like guys in taxi cabs like Mel Gibson in Conspiracy Theory, like I would not be surprised if they're right about some shit. Like, I'll give you one funny story, and like we're definitely running short. My phone's about to die, and like we're way over, and that's cool. But like this is one of the best conversations I've ever had. But like I was in Minneapolis at a Veterans for Peace conference this weekend, giving a series of speeches, and like after the speech was over, like there was like catered dinner, and I was so goddamn hungry because it was like a long conference, and I spoke for almost 2 hours after the Q&A, and all I wanted to do was eat. But like people were really impressed with my speech and like really thankful, and they were all like Vietnam era, like gray hairs, who were just like happy to see a young guy who agrees with them. And like one person after another was talking to me, and then finally this guy, you ever look at a person and before they even open their mouth, you look in their eyes and you know they're crazy,
Oh yeah.
I had that situation. Like, there's just something about their dead shark eyes that tells you like, oh, this is going to go badly. And this guy started telling me about like all his secrets he knew, and he was in the Navy for 4 years during peacetime, so he knows shit that I can't ever possibly know. And I was like, oh boy. And then he was like, I'll give you an example, man. He was like, the world is flat, right? And like the thing is, he was dead serious, and he talked to me about a flat world for like 4 minutes that I'll never get back. Like, when I'm on my deathbed, I'm gonna be wishing I had those 4 minutes back. But the point I'm making is, like, even that guy, like, the world's not flat, guys, but like even that guy or his counterpart, like some of them are right, maybe. Like, that's my theory on conspiracy theories. Like, I'm a skeptic of them, But I wouldn't be surprised if some of these fucking so-called crazies and flakes are actually right about some shit, at least in a general sense.
Hey, every single time Alex Jones will say 10 things, 9 of them will be crazy. I mean, he's bound to get something right by accident at one point.
Half
right?
of one will be true.
You know
right,
what he does.
Broken clock twice a day, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What happens is that they'll see something like, with Alex Jones, he'll see something like Harvard scientists theorize that they could cool climates by putting in trails in the sky, and then he'll be like, well, chemtrails are finally coming. It's coming true.
That was a remarkably good impression on the fly.
We've had a year to practice.
I've been working on my Alex Jones for a while, as people know. It used to be a lot more in tune with the show. Should bring it back though.
Yeah, we definitely should. Well, Danny, this has been awesome, and I know that we've gone over, and I know your phone's going to die. So I just wanted to thank you again for coming on the show, and I wanted to give you a quick opportunity to plug anything that you're working on, so that our listeners can support you.
Yeah, I love you guys, and this is something I hope to do regularly. Listen, I'm on Twitter @SkepticalVet, which describes me pretty well. I write weekly columns at TruthDig and Antiwar.com, and I write monthly or bi-weekly columns across the range from The Nation to the LA Times. Bottom line, I've got a crazy last name, Sjursen. Google it. There's a lot of shit online. I've got a lot to say. At least half of it's decent. And thanks, guys, for the opportunity.
And no more disclaimer anymore, right? Or do we still need to put that in?
No more disclaimer.
Right.
I do speak for me, and I don't give a shit about the U.S. government or the military anymore. So disclaimer's gone.
Well, congratulations on that.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, fellas.
Do you want to know what it's like to hang out with MS-13 in El Salvador? Or how the Russian mafia fought battles all over Brooklyn in the 1990s?
What about that time I got lost in the Burmese jungle hunting the world's biggest meth lab? I'm Sean Williams.
And I'm Danny Gold. And we're the hosts of the Underworld Podcast. We're journalists that have traveled all over, reporting on dangerous people and places. And every week, we'll be bringing you a new story about organized crime from all over the world.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.